I want you to just try to paint a picture in your mind right now. Just put yourself there completely. It is late August, but you would absolutely never know it from the temperature. You're off the coast of Newfoundland and Labrador, and the freezing, fog-choked waters of the North Atlantic are just wrapping around you like this heavy, wet blanket. Listen to the visceral sounds of the ocean out there. There's this deep, agonizing groaning of heavy timber as your ship sort of rolls in the massive swells. There's this sudden, violent slap of freezing waves against the wooden hull. And right above you, cutting through this dense, blinding mist, is the haunting, erratic, just almost desperate flapping of massive canvas sails snapping in a bitter, unpredictable wind. I mean, imagine you were staring out into the freezing abyss of the North Atlantic, and the abyss just, sends something back.
Yeah, and stepping into that exact picture, imagine being on the deck of a Royal Navy gunboat during that moment. Like, you are a highly disciplined sailor. Your entire world is governed by order, by this rigid hierarchy of naval command, by bells and watches and pristine decks. But as you peer into that endless, shifting gray wall of fog, a shape emerges that just completely defies all of that order. It's a fully rigged merchant brig, and it's moving. It is alive with kinetic energy, rolling and pitching with the wind, but the way it moves is entirely wrong. To a trained eye, it looks like a zombie. It's a vessel that is alive with movement, but utterly devoid of a soul.
Right. And that imagery just sets the perfect state of mind for what we are doing today, because we are taking a deep dive into one of the most chilling, entirely unsolved maritime nightmares in history. When we're talking about the mystery of the SV Resolven, and we are looking at historical logs, Royal Navy reports, and some deeply, deeply unsettling local Newfoundland lore to try and piece this whole tragedy together. Because, this isn't just a story about a lost ship. It is a terrifying exploration of human panic, of absolute isolation, and the incredibly unforgiving, indifferent power of the ocean. It's a real-life horror story that actually earned the Resolven the title of the Welsh Mary Celeste. So, okay, let's unpack this. How do 11 living, breathing people just vanish into thin air, leaving behind a perfectly seaworthy ship, warm food sitting on a table, and a fire still burning in the stove?
Well, to even begin to penetrate that mystery, to really understand the mechanics of how 11 people essentially evaporated from a floating wooden fortress, we have to understand the specific environment they were trapped in. I mean, this is the ultimate locked room mystery, except the room is subjected to the violent fluid dynamics of a deadly ocean. We need to look at who these people were and, more importantly, the psychological landscape they were navigating before the physical disaster even struck. So the Resolven itself was a sturdy, working-class vessel. It was named after a village in Neath, Port Talbot in Wales, but its home port was Aberystwyth.
So we are talking about a ship built for absolute utility here, not luxury, right? Like, it's built to take a beating.
Yeah. Oh, in every sense, yeah. This was a merchant brig built for hard, grueling labor. During the late 19th century, the maritime trade routes between Wales and Canada were just brutal. This ship was designed to haul massive, heavy cargoes of raw timber and salted cod across one of the most volatile stretches of water on the entire planet. The men who worked these routes were hardened by physical labor. And the man in charge of this floating workplace was Captain John James of Newquay. He was responsible for the lives of 7 crew members and 4 passengers, so 11 souls in total. But, the historical sources reveal a crucial vulnerability, like this psychological crack in the foundation of this voyage that dictates everything that follows. According to the Maritime records, not a single one of the 11 people on board was accustomed to northern waters.
Wait, really? Not a single one? Help me understand the gravity of that, because on the surface, a sailor's a sailor, right? You know how to rig a sail, you know how to steer a ship. Why does the specific latitude matter so much?
It matters immensely because the North Atlantic isn't just water. It is an entirely different, almost predatory environment. Sailing in temperate or southern routes involves a certain set of predictable weather patterns, familiar constellations, and relatively forgiving temperatures. But the waters off Newfoundland, the area infamous as Iceberg Alley, are just a different world entirely. The fog is so dense it literally creates sensory deprivation. The currents are violent and erratic, and the water temperature is lethal. I mean, if you fall in, you don't swim to safety. Your muscles lock up and you die in minutes.
Oh, wow. So to put you, the listener, in their shoes for a second, just think about the last time your power went out in the middle of the night during a severe storm. Your house, a place you know intimately, suddenly feels completely alien, right? You hear a creak in the floorboards and your heart rate just spikes. The baseline anxiety is dialed up to a 10. Now multiply that feeling by 1,000. You are dropped into the middle of a forest at midnight, but you've only ever lived your entire life in a brightly lit city. You don't know the sounds. You don't know the shadows. Imagine the sheer psychological terror these 11 people must have felt navigating Iceberg Alley. Every single sound the ship makes is just magnified in their minds.
Exactly. And if we connect this to the bigger picture of survival psychology, this profound lack of experience in these specific hostile waters plants the seeds of deep, paralyzing paranoia long before any physical danger actually strikes. We are talking about the slow, agonizing erosion of rational thought. A piece of drift ice scraping along the wooden hull isn't just a noise to this inexperienced crew. In the pitch black, it sounds like the ship's very structure is being torn wide open. The bone-chilling cold isn't just uncomfortable, it's a constant, visceral reminder of how quickly they would perish if the hull breached. The deep isolation from anything familiar creates this massive pressure cooker of anxiety.
Yeah, I mean, they were operating at a baseline of sheer dread. They were essentially primed to panic the very moment anything went wrong.
They absolutely were. They were physically exhausted by the cold, sleep-deprived from the constant vigilance required in that dense fog, and mentally strained by the unfamiliarity of the threat. And that is the fragile, terrifying psychological stage that was set on August 29th, 1884. Which brings us to the day the nightmare was actually discovered by the outside world.
Right, let's set that scene. So, we are drifting somewhere in the cold, gray waters between Baccalieu Island and Catalina, Newfoundland, and enter the Royal Navy. Specifically, the gunboat HMS Mallard under the command of Lieutenant William L.H. Brown. You have a disciplined, orderly naval vessel, and then they spot the Resolven. And, the first thing that Navy sailors notice isn't that the ship is abandoned. The first thing they notice is that the physical movement of the ship is profoundly wrong. It's under full sail, but its movements are described in the official logs as odd and erratic.
Yeah, and we really have to pause here to understand the physics and the language of the sea. Because to an experienced sailor like Lieutenant Brown, an erratic ship is an immediate, glaring alarm bell. A ship is a complex machine designed to harness wind power and channel it into forward momentum through the resistance of the rudder. When you have a square-rigged brig under full sail catching the massive force of the North Atlantic wind, but there is no helmsman at the wheel controlling the rudder, you essentially have a wild, wounded animal on your hands.
Because the sails are just catching the wind haphazardly, like it's just out of control.
Yes, the fluid dynamics become completely chaotic at that point. The ship will catch the wind, surge forward violently, and then because there is no steering to hold the line, it will just veer off course. The sails will suddenly lose the wind, what sailors call being taken aback, and the heavy canvas will violently snap against the masts with this thunderous crack. Then the ship will stall, drift sideways into the trough of a massive wave, roll aggressively, and eventually spin back around to catch the wind from a completely different angle. It is dangerous, it's unpredictable, and to a seasoned mariner, it is a profound violation of the natural order of the sea. It signals immediately that the brain of the ship, the human element, is entirely gone.
Man, so the Mallard approach is this wild, thrashing animal of a ship.
Yeah.
And they do the protocol, right? They try to hail it. Imagine this for a second. You have these Navy sailors leaning over the wooden rails, shouting through speaking trumpets, their voices just fighting against the howling wind and the deafening sound of crashing waves. They are calling out, "Ahoy, do you need assistance?" And then they just wait.
Right, it's that agonizing wait for a reply that never ever comes.
Yeah, the shouts echo over the water. They just get absorbed by the fog. And then you just have this deafening silence from the crew. The sails are flapping wildly, the heavy rigging is snapping under the strain, the timber is groaning, but there's no human voice answering back. The tension on the deck of the Mallard must have been just unbearable. You can see the deck, no one is there, no one is at the wheel, the ship is just wandering blindly. So Lieutenant Brown gives the inevitable order. He commands a boarding party to go over and find out what on earth is actually happening.
And this is the exact moment the narrative shifts abruptly. We go from an external naval encounter, 2 ships passing in the mist, to an incredibly intimate, claustrophobic crime scene investigation. The boarding party lowers their cutter, they row over through the freezing, churning water, and they hook onto the side of the Resolven. They step over the gunwales.
I want to walk through this really slowly because this sequence is exactly where the Welsh Mary Celeste legend is officially born. The sailors step onto the deck. They have their weapons drawn. In this era, encountering an abandoned ship usually meant one of 2 things, a catastrophic sinking or violence. They're fully expecting pirates. They're expecting mutineers. They're expecting to slip on blood. But there are no bodies. There is no blood. There are no signs of a violent struggle whatsoever. The deck is relatively clear. The ship itself is intact and, for all intents and purposes, entirely seaworthy. It's not sinking. It's not taking on massive amounts of water.
No, it is functionally a perfectly healthy ship. But as the boarding party ventures below decks, descending into the dark, cramped living quarters, they find the eerie, undeniable signs of recent mundane life. The sensory details documented in the naval reports are just unforgettable, and they are what elevate this from a regular shipwreck to a straight-up ghost story. They walk into the galley, and the iron stove fire is still burning.
Okay, let's focus on that for a second. A coal or wood fire on a ship requires constant tending, right? If the fire is still burning, someone was feeding it just moments, maybe a few hours ago.
Exactly. And the lamps are also lit, casting these flickering, ghostly shadows against the wooden bulkheads. This tells us they were operating in darkness or deep fog, actively trying to illuminate their space. And most chillingly of all, food is sitting on the table, abandoned mid-meal. We are talking about hardtack, salted meat, the staples of a sailor's diet, just sitting on plates. It wasn't cleared away, it wasn't prepared and left to sit, it was actively being consumed.
Right, here's where it gets really interesting, though. Because as creepy as an abandoned meal is, the boarding party finds the captain's logbook. The logbook is the official legal heartbeat of any vessel. It tracks heading, weather, incidents, and it is sitting wide open on the desk. The Navy officers check the ink. The final entry was made just 6 hours before HMS Mallard spotted them. 6 hours.
And in the context of a transatlantic voyage, 6 hours is absolutely nothing.
I really want to emphasize this to the listener. 6 hours is the blink of an eye. You go to sleep, you wake up, that's more than 6 hours. What could possibly happen in a 6-hour window that makes 11 perfectly rational people stand up from a warm, safe meal, leave the fire burning, leave the lamps lit, walk out onto the freezing deck, and step off a perfectly good, floating ship into the lethal waters of the North Atlantic? It completely defies all human logic. You do not leave a floating wooden fortress for a watery grave unless the alternative on board is perceived as unimaginably worse.
Which naturally leads the investigators to the final damning piece of the puzzle on the deck. The one detail that proves this wasn't some bizarre freak accident where, a single massive rogue wave washed all 11 people overboard at the exact same moment. The ship's lifeboat was gone.
Wow. So we can definitively rule out the rogue wave. This was an active choice.
It was. The falls, those are the heavy rope systems attached to the davits used to lower the lifeboat they were deployed. This was a deliberate, terrified evacuation. They chose to leave. They actively piled 11 people, 7 hardened crew members, and 4 passengers into a tiny open wooden boat in the middle of a freezing hostile ocean. We have clearly established how they left the ship. But as investigators of this mystery, we now have to dissect why. What was the horrific catalyst that forced that fatal choice?
Well, to answer that, we have to pull our focus outside the ship. We have to look at the environmental clues that the Navy sailors noted in their logs while they were securing the Resolven.
Right, and the most massive, ominous detail spotted near the drifting Resolven was a large iceberg.
Just this silent, massive mountain of ice looming out there in the fog.
Yeah. And when we combine the undeniable presence of that iceberg with the specific physical damage the boarding party did find on the ship, a very specific, terrifying sequence of events begins to form. Because the Resolven was seaworthy, yes, but it wasn't pristine. It had suffered a recent trauma. The naval logs meticulously note 3 things: a broken yard, a smashed stem, and an unshipped rudder.
Okay, let's break those terms down for the listener who, isn't a 19th century shipwright.
Sure. So the yard is the heavy horizontal wooden spar on a mast from which the square sails are set. It's high up in the rigging. The stem is the extreme forward end of the ship's bow, the heavy timber that literally cuts through the water. And the rudder, crucially, was unshipped.
Unshipped meaning it was violently dislodged or broken off its hinges, right? Like you couldn't steer at all. I know the hinges on these massive wooden rudders are called pintles and gudgeons. They're these heavy iron pins dropping into iron loops. It takes a massive amount of sheer kinetic force to snap that ironwork.
Exactly the kind of force generated by a multi-ton wooden ship grinding against the underwater ice shelf of an iceberg. So if we take these physical clues, the smashed front, the broken upper rigging, the destroyed steering, and combine them with the psychological profile we established earlier of an inexperienced crew terrified of northern waters, we can scientifically reconstruct the panic.
Oh man, let's play this out minute by minute, because it's dark. The fog is incredibly thick, limiting visibility to maybe a few feet off the bow. The crew is already on edge, listening to the groaning of the timber. They are below decks. They're eating a warm meal, trying to stave off the biting cold. The lamps are throwing these long shadows. And suddenly, Without any warning whatsoever, a colossal, pale shadow emerges from the fog right in front of them, the iceberg.
And there is zero time to react.
No.
The momentum of the ship carries it forward. There is a deafening, violent crunch as the stem, the very front of the ship, smashes head-on against the immovable wall of ice. The impact sends a massive shock wave through the entire vessel. Plates and food crash off the table. The passengers are violently thrown to the wooden floorboards. The ship then grinds along the side of the iceberg. The overhanging ice snags the rigging, snapping the yard high above, sending heavy timber and canvas crashing down onto the deck. And as the stern of the ship violently scrapes past the underwater shelf of the ice, the heavy iron pintles and gudgeons of the rudder shear completely off. The rudder is rendered utterly useless.
And suddenly, all that violent noise stops, replaced by the terrifying realization that the ship is just dead in the water. It can't steer. It's drifting helplessly in the massive swells.
Right, and this is where we have to delve into the biology of panic. It's a phenomenon neurologists call amygdala hijack. In a crisis, a seasoned captain in familiar waters might override his fear with logic. He would immediately sound the well, which means dropping a weighted line into the bilge to see if the hull was breached and taking on water. He would realize that a smashed stem and a broken rudder are catastrophic for navigation, sure, but if the hull integrity holds, the ship remains a buoyant raft. It will keep you alive. But an inexperienced crew, already operating at maximum psychological stress, their brains bypass the prefrontal cortex, the logic center, entirely. The amygdala, the fear center, just takes over. They don't assess, they don't check for water. They hear the horrific sound of the collision, they feel the ship drifting aimlessly, and they instinctually believe the vessel is fatally wounded. They believe they have minutes, maybe seconds before it plunges to the bottom of the Atlantic, dragging them down with the massive suction.
God, it makes me think of an analogy. Imagine you were driving down a dark, isolated highway in the middle of a severe blizzard. Your car hits a massive patch of black ice, spins out, slams into the guardrail, and the engine completely stalls. Now, structurally, your car is perfectly safe, right? It's a heavy metal cage protecting you from the freezing wind and the snow. But you are so pumped full of adrenaline, so irrationally panicked that the car is going to spontaneously explode, that you unbuckle your seatbelt, kick your door open, and jump out of the stalled car directly into the path of oncoming traffic in the blizzard.
Yeah, that analogy perfectly captures the absolute tragedy of human error under extreme duress. They traded a damaged but entirely buoyant provisioned fortress for a freezing, watery grave. Because we really have to remember the mechanics of lowering a lifeboat in a swell. You have 11 terrified people trying to winch a heavy wooden boat down the side of a larger ship that is rolling violently. If they even manage to get it into the water without capsizing immediately, they are now in a tiny, overloaded open boat, swamped by freezing waves, trying to navigate away from a massive drifting ship and a deadly iceberg in the pitch black. I mean, it is a death sentence. The Resolven survived the ice, it stayed afloat, but that lifeboat almost certainly did not. The ocean simply swallowed them.
It is heartbreakingly tragic. They literally killed themselves out of the fear of dying. But, I'm not going to let us close the book just yet, because as with all great historical mysteries, the environmental theory is just one angle. The sources give us other far darker theories. What if the horror wasn't the ocean at all? What if the catalyst was human nature?
Well, when a mystery leaves a vacuum of facts, the human imagination inevitably rushes in to fill it with sinister alternatives. It always does.
So let's explore the robbery and mutiny theory. Because almost immediately after the Royal Navy towed the Resolven into port, the whispers started on the docks. Rumors swirled that Captain James was known to carry a substantial stash of gold coins on board to pay for cargo and wages. Suddenly, you don't have a story about an iceberg collision, you have a story about violent greed. Was there a mutiny? Did a faction of the crew snap, turn on the captain, murder him, and throw him to the deep? Or worse, were they all forced into the lifeboat at gunpoint by pirates who vanished back into the fog with the gold?
It's a narrative built for a penny dreadful novel of the era, honestly. But as investigators, we have to look at the physical evidence left at the crime scene. And the evidence provides a massive, seemingly insurmountable pushback to the robbery or mutiny theory. If this was a pirate attack motivated by wealth, the perpetrators were either the most incompetent criminals in maritime history, or they were interrupted by something so terrifying they abandoned their prize.
Right, because of what the Navy actually found in the captain's cabin.
Correct. The boarding party found a small package containing 100 pounds, entirely untouched, just sitting in plain sight.
Okay, let me play devil's advocate here for a second. In the chaos of a mutiny, in the pitch black of a ship's cabin, with a storm raging outside, Isn't it entirely possible that a panicked pirate just missed a small drawer or overlooked a wrapped package? Like, why does this single package completely debunk the mutiny theory for you?
Well, we have to look at the socioeconomic reality of 100 pounds in 1884. This isn't pocket change. This isn't a forgotten $20 bill on a dresser. In 1884, 100 pounds was equivalent to several years' wages for a working-class merchant sailor. It was life-changing wealth. Criminals motivated by that level of wealth, who have already committed mass murder or forced 11 people into the sea, do not conduct a cursory search. They tear the cabin apart to the floorboards. The physical space of a captain's quarters on a working brig is incredibly small. There aren't many places to hide. If you were there for the money, you'll find the money.
So the fact that it was left behind is just a glaring inconsistency.
It creates a huge paradox. If they left the money, it means either the entire robbery theory is a fabricated dockside rumor, or whatever drove them off the ship happened so fast and was so utterly terrifying that hardened mutineers abandon a literal fortune just to escape with their lives. And honestly, the idea of a threat so horrifying that it makes a murderer forget a fortune in gold is almost scarier than the iceberg theory. It keeps the mystery alive and forces us to look toward the coast, toward even stranger explanations.
Which brings us to what happened after. Because if they didn't drown immediately in the swamped lifeboat, and if they weren't murdered, is it biologically possible anyone made it to shore? Which brings us to what I think is the most unsettling Gothic legend tied to the Resolven in all the historical sources.
Oh, the legend of Random Island.
Yes. Let's turn the lights down low for this one because it feels like a dark campfire story. But it is deeply embedded in the local historical lore of Newfoundland. Shortly after the Royal Navy discovered the ghostly Resolven drifting out at sea, a terrifying encounter supposedly occurred on land in a rugged, isolated place called Deer Harbor near Trinity Bay. According to the legend, two local brothers were exploring the thick brush near the shoreline of Random Island. They're walking through the woods, pushing aside branches, and they walk up to a large tree. And sitting underneath that tree, propped up against the trunk, they find a dead man.
But the details of this corpse are what explicitly tie it to our mystery.
I want you to visualize the horror of this discovery. The brothers approach carefully. The corpse is dressed in a full, formal ship captain's uniform. It is soaked through, frozen stiff. He's sitting there propped against the rough bark, and his dead, frozen eyes are staring straight out over the unforgiving sea that he had just somehow miraculously escaped.
It is an incredibly powerful, deeply macabre image. A man who defeated the immense power of the ocean only to succumb to the cold reality of the land. We actually have to look at the medical reality of this. If this was Captain James, he would have survived the lifeboat swamping, fought his way through the freezing surf, and dragged himself onto the rocky beach. But his core body temperature would be plummeting rapidly. Hypothermia is a brutal, agonizing process. As the body shuts down, victims often experience a phenomenon called terminal burrowing, which is a primal instinct to find an enclosed, protective space, like the base of a large tree. They sit down, their organs fail, and they freeze solidly in place.
But here's the dark secret, the twist of human nature that makes this story so incredibly grim. The brothers find this captain frozen to death under a tree, and they do absolutely nothing. They never report the body to the local magistrate. They never flag down the naval authorities who are currently scouring the entire coast for the missing crew of the Resolven. They walk away in complete silence.
And we have to analyze the psychology behind that silence. Why would you find a deceased mariner an obvious tragedy and not report it? In 19th century coastal communities, maritime salvage and assisting shipwreck victims was a moral and legal duty. To hide a body implies a crime of opportunity.
Right, because according to the local lore, shortly after this macabre discovery under the tree, one of those brothers suddenly and completely inexplicably became very, very wealthy. He was suddenly flush with gold coins.
Which brings all our theories crashing together in the worst way. Was the body under the tree Captain John James of the Resolven? Did he actually survive the lifeboat disaster? Did he watch his passengers and his crew drown in the pitch black, manage to ride the freezing surf onto the rocky shores of Random Island, dragging his heavy stash of gold coins with him to shore? Did he survive the shipwreck, endure the unimaginable horror of the ocean, only to die of exposure, alone under a tree, only to be found and robbed by the very locals who should have been his salvation?
It is so incredibly dark. Just dwell on the sheer isolation of that final moment. The tragedy of fighting for your life in a tiny, swamped lifeboat, watching everyone you are responsible for die. making it to the beach by some miracle, collapsing against a tree, watching the water, and freezing to death. And your legacy isn't one of miraculous survival. Your legacy is being a loot drop for two guys walking through the woods. It adds this profound layer of human ugliness to an already devastating tragedy.
It really does. It completely strips away any romanticism from the sea and survival. It reduces human life to a brutal, cold equation of endurance and greed. But here's where the story takes its final, inevitable turn. Even with the crew gone, whether they drowned at the iceberg, were murdered for their money, or froze to death on a desolate beach, the physical ship, the SV Resolven, wasn't done with the sea.
No, she sails on. Because maritime salvage in the 1880s is a cold, strictly pragmatic business, isn't it? There's no room for sentimentality when there's money to be made.
Absolutely not. The salvage laws of the era were extremely clear. A seaworthy ship found abandoned is a massive financial asset to whoever secures it. The Royal Navy wasn't going to let a perfectly good, oak-built merchant brig drift around as a hazard to navigation or rot away out of superstition. They towed the ghostly vessel into the port at Catalina, and there it underwent a process of sanitization. The ship was scrubbed clean, the abandoned meals were thrown overboard, any lingering personal effects, the clothes, the letters home, the open logbook, they were all boxed up. The shipwrights came aboard, the broken yard was repaired, a new heavy iron rudder was shipped onto the stern, the smashed stem was patched with new timber, the Resolven was sold at auction to a new owner, and an entirely new crew was hired to walk its decks.
God, I just had to pause on that reality. Put yourself in the boots of a 19th century sailor. You are a man looking for work on the docks. You sign a contract to serve on a brig. And you know, because everyone in every port from Wales to Newfoundland knows, that the last 11 people who stood on these exact wooden planks vanished into thin air. Can you imagine the psychological weight of serving on that ship? Would you ever sleep deeply in the captain's quarters? Would you be able to sit down and eat a meal in that galley without looking over your shoulder at the iron stove, wondering what absolute terror the last crew felt in their final moments before they ran for the deck? The ship is stained with an invisible trauma.
Yeah, and sailors are notoriously superstitious, and they are superstitious for a very logical reason. Their lives depend entirely on environmental forces they cannot control or predict. Stepping onto a ship with a dark, unresolved history is viewed as an act of profound defiance against those forces. You are tempting fate. And in the case of the Resolven, that defiance was ultimately met with absolute finality. Misfortune struck a second and final time.
The sea always collects its debts eventually.
It does. 3 years later, in the year 1887, the Resolven, operating under its new ownership, was returning to Newfoundland from a port in Nova Scotia. It was carrying a massive, heavy load of lumber, and this time there was no mystery. There was no ghostly drifting, no warm meals left on the table. The sea claimed the ship completely. A massive storm caught the Resolven, overpowered the crew, and the vessel was wrecked, destroyed by the elements, taking its timbers and whatever dark secrets it still held down to the freezing bottom of the ocean. The story of the physical ship ended just as violently and just as tragically as the story of its original crew.
So what does this all mean for us sitting here today? We have this incredibly dense, terrifying story. We have a ship found perfectly intact with warm food on the table and a fire in the stove. We have a missing lifeboat, shattered rigging, rumors of gold, frozen captains robbed under trees, and a cursed vessel that ultimately meets its doom at the bottom of the sea anyway. The absolute terror of the Resolven isn't just that it's a spooky story of a shipwreck. It's a testament to the absolute terrifying vulnerability of humans the second we step off the solid land and try to master the water.
I agree completely. And if we reflect on why the Welsh Mary Celeste terrifies us today, well over a century later, it's because it strips away our illusion of control. It forces us to confront the ocean as a massive, entirely indifferent force. We build these complex wooden machines, we chart the stars to navigate, we write detailed logs and keep rigid schedules, all in an attempt to tame the wildness of the world. We firmly believe our logic will save us. But the ocean can trigger a primal panic that overrides all of that logic. It can swallow 11 lives in an instant, and it can leave a warm meal sitting perfectly undisturbed on a table just to mock the people who tried to conquer it. As humans, we want neat endings. We want to know exactly what the iceberg sounded like when it hit. We want to know exactly who stole the gold from the body. But the sea doesn't owe us answers. It only offers silence.
Man, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final, lingering thought to mull over tonight. We talked about the biology of panic, the irrational decision to leave the safe ship for the tiny lifeboat. I want you to close your eyes and put yourself in that lifeboat. Imagine being the last person alive in that tiny, swamped wooden boat. The cold has taken the rest of the crew. You are completely surrounded by pitch black, freezing water. You look back through the dense gray fog. And there, slipping away into the distance, you see the Resolven. It is perfectly intact. The lanterns are still burning brightly, casting warm light on the fog. It is sailing away from you, riding the swells perfectly fine, without a single soul on board. You realize in your final moments that you didn't just abandon your ship abandoned you.
It is the ultimate betrayal by the very thing designed to save your life.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the abyss. Keep your lights on tonight.